Dr. Toope， 英国剑桥大学校长，2016年获颁加拿大最高荣誉勋章加拿大官佐勋章，许木柱，慈济大学副校长，为研究台湾原住民之著名人类学专家，严云，前台北医学大学校长，慈济基金会董事，在血液肿瘤、骨髓移植等领域钻研极深，心灵讲座以慈济国际发展与人道賑灾主题切入，邀请3位对谈来宾分享教育的本质，鼓励年轻人跨出步伐，让心无国界，以大爱作为国际桥梁。
Welcome everybody. It's our great honor to invite Dr. Toope to participate this dialogue, and also welcome Vice President Xu from Tzu Chi University. Yeah, before we started, I would like to maybe just focus on the NGO itself before we started. So my first question to Dr. Toope is, would you mind to introduce us about your experience in the global affairs and the NGOs? Because at this moment, NGOs has quite significant difficulties in the overall, especially dealing with so many new things, new challenges. Yeah, please.
Well, thank you, and I'm very honored to be here, and I really appreciate the invitation to be with you and to salute the remarkable work that you do. I was very fortunate that when I first became a professor in a law school, it was always encouraged to really be active in the wider society and not to isolate oneself within the academy and not really think about what was happening in the world. And so right from the very beginning, as a young professor, I was a volunteer on a number of relief and development organizations, one associated with the Anglican Church of Canada. I became chair of that relief and development organization. And then later I worked with an organization called World University Service of Canada, which has a wonderful program of bringing refugee students to Canada to allow them to complete their education. These would be students of graduate levels, so they're coming into university. And I became chair of that organization, which I enjoyed very much, and then also have worked all of my career in the area of human rights. And so I've also been a volunteer and board member and chair of a number of different human rights organizations in Canada and internationally. And you mentioned disappearances. That wasn't an NGO, but it worked very closely with NGOs because I was able to be chair of what's called the United Nations Working Group on Enforced or Involuntary Disappearances. And that is charged with looking at situations of disappearance for political reasons all around the world. And I had to deal with literally tens of thousands of cases of disappearances. Was a pattern that started in Latin America, in Chile and Argentina in the times of the military juntas, but then extended sadly into many countries all around the world, including some countries in Southeast Asia. And so I had the great privilege of trying to help find disappeared people, and I can say more about that. But all through these endeavors, the sense that one could use the education, the skills that have been given to me through a very fortunate life to actually assist other people has always been very rewarding.
Thanks, Dr. Toope. Yeah, how about VP Xu? I know you are the expert in anthropology. So when you get involved in the different NGO besides Tzu Chi, yeah, what your experience from the anthropology point of view? Yeah.
For the NGO experience, I participated in Tzu Chi's international compassionate relief work since 2004. The first time was in Indonesia, and since then, that kind of experience continued until now. So it has been about 12 years. And that's my experience in participating in NGOs activities. And basically, those are charity aid. And because of my role as a scholar, we offer some kind of educational program to help the local students in Indonesia or in Thailand for them to develop themselves.
I think always we have a conflict as far as talking about bringing volunteers such as students under the jeopardy or versus the charity. So I believe that's all the NGOs related about this issue. For example, medical doctors, without border, we all know every year we lost several lives. Yeah. So how you see this kind of a difficulty to continue this NGO and how to protect them?
It's a huge problem. I'm sure many of your viewers will know that in the last decade to 15 years, the attacks on volunteers through international organizations have increased dramatically. So it is more dangerous than ever, sadly, to be a volunteer working with any organization in many parts of the world. This extends to journalists, it extends to aid workers, it extends to medical assistants. I actually think this is an issue that countries have to take more seriously. I think there are a couple of international treaties on the protection of international workers who are volunteers and aid assistants, but I don't think that there's a serious effort yet that's been given to try to figure out how better to protect people who are working in very vulnerable positions. And for example, in northern Kenya, there are people who have grown up, who were born and grown up in these refugee camps. When they don't have much of a sense of hope, when they don't see a future, and when they can be radicalized by people around them to try to develop resistance in, frankly, not a very helpful way, but in a violent way, this is growing as a phenomenon. And so I think that many countries should be looking at how better to increase security in refugee camps and how to provide security for aid workers when they're in more distributed settings across various countries. One of the key elements there is training for people who volunteer or are working for aid organizations. Training, I think, is important, but so too is thinking through better mechanisms to provide security, which costs money, unfortunately.
I agree. I think especially the lately, like Syrian issues, that is even more complicated. It's not just a country, that could be countries. Yes. So the different law, different cultures. So that complicated the whole scenario. Yeah. So Dr. Xu, I know you've been in many countries as well, represented Tzu Chi. Yeah, what do you see our volunteer, including our students, they involve in these the medical release or compassionate release, and as a leader you are, yeah, how you protect their security, safety, and how you convince their legal guardians about letting go for them. Yeah.
The Tzu Chi comparatively quite safe and in order usually. But of course, sometimes it might be a little bit out of order because the disastrous societies may be in chaos sometimes. So in that case, our volunteers need the government to protect the volunteers But usually my team, we were doing educational aid and compassionate relief. So especially local volunteers would make a good arrangement for the compassionate relief. They were not serious problems.
If I could add a comment, your point is very, very important. I think it's crucial when people volunteer that there is a good relationship with a local organization, and it could be local volunteers for the same organization or another, and that is actually one of the best guarantors of security for volunteer workers.
Also, I see the Tzu Chi compassionate release not just for material release. Also, they've been heavily involved in the medical, and besides the medical, and they also put in the education component into it. So when they educate them, there is no religious issue. That's just keep the good local education for local people. So I think this is also a very interesting observations. Yeah. However, education itself cannot live without culture and judgmental sometimes. So that being also debatable at this point. So when we talk about helping people, do we think we carry our own bias about helping? So you have any comments about that? Yeah.
Well, I think inevitably the answer is yes. We all have our own biases as to what matters more, what matters less, what is right, what is wrong. A very obvious example is the simple desire to allow girls to be educated. There are parts of the world and cultural circumstance in which there are people who fundamentally believe that girls should not be educated. Obviously, I don't hold that belief. I think it's misguided. So if one works in those settings, and the organization I mentioned earlier that brings refugees to Canada, refugee students, also supports girl education in refugee camps. And you have to do that sensitively, and you have to do it working with local leaders who share the view that girls should be educated, so that it doesn't appear to be simply an imposition from the outside. That's just one example, but there are many. I think we always carry biases with us. That doesn't mean they're wrong. They actually might be favorable biases, but they are coming from a particular cultural construct, which is not the same necessarily as the cultural construct in which one finds oneself.
Follow up the issue of girls' education, Dr. Toope just mentioned. We had this kind of similar situation in Indonesia. From 2004, and then we went there to continue our study and also continue our educational aid program between 2006 and 2009. And during that period, we found that the girls' education were not respected in Indonesia because they favor males more than females. But we found that the girls in the Great Love Village, Tzu Chi Foundation in Indonesia helped to build, really worked very hard, especially in their studies, in their academic performance. So one of our team, a professor in educational psychology, urged the parents in the village to allow their daughters to have more time to study, and even organizing a study group. I think that kind of activities may make some change for example, girls' education.
That's a good point. Yeah. From another point of view, the UN always looking for the replacement for the refugees. For example, Canada, Germany, they all give a lot of hands in helping them and relocate them back to their own country. Yeah. However, at this moment, people also argue with it. You want to change them to be a Canadian, or you want to keep their culture? And then even more is, do you want to introduce the native Canadians to learn the new cultures? What do you see this complicated scenario at this point?
The first point I'd make is most refugees would rather go home to their own country if they could do so in a knowledge that they would have security and opportunity. So the real challenge, I think, is trying to resolve situations of conflict that are driving refugees out of their home countries. The second point I'd make is, in fact, most refugees are on the borders of their own countries, in places where you've worked, for Jordan, for example. Syrian refugees, only a tiny percentage of them is found in Canada now, or even in Germany. Most are near Turkey, or in Turkey, or in Jordan, etc. The real problem for refugees remains in the global south, not in the north, although the north gets a lot of the press around this. Now, Canada, in terms of the Syrian refugees, has accepted about 40,000 Syrian refugees. There are millions, literally millions of Syrian refugees, and most of them can't go to Canada or the US or Germany or Sweden or wherever else they may, where we might imagine they go. So we have to work harder to find ways to help them survive, thrive, learn, be educated, find jobs in the countries where they actually find themselves. To your point, though, about cultural difference, I think there's a very big difference between countries like Canada that are really countries of immigration, where aside from the indigenous people, everyone comes from somewhere else. And so for Canada, I think it's actually a bit easier, frankly, to understand and accept a new wave of immigrants. We've had many, many waves. Vietnamese immigrants after the collapse of South Vietnam during the war. Tens of thousands of Vietnamese have succeeded brilliantly in Canadian society. I think it is actually harder for countries that aren't used to that. Now, that doesn't justify repression, it doesn't justify racism, but I do think we have to be sensitive to countries where the whole dynamic is much more around a homogeneous understanding of race and culture. And I think we have to help people learn that it's possible for newcomers to arrive and be assimilated. And I think it does require movement on both sides. People who come from other places into new countries have to be willing to learn new ways. But I also think that hosts have to be willing to be open to learn things from the new people who've arrived. And I can certainly tell you, the city that I currently live in Toronto, has changed fundamentally since the 1950s, when it was largely a white Protestant city with a few Jewish people and a few Greeks and a few Italians, to a city now where half of the population comes from somewhere else. Half was not born in Toronto.
I think, yeah, you bring up the good points, but another issue we haven't resolved is the rare species, which is politicians. They run a show, in fact. So I wish they all carry the humanity as you just mentioned it, but I think people, the common people, fully understand that because they have a good nature. Politicians, they have to think about twice about their current and next round and their party, all in all. So do you have any suggestion about educating these politicians about using the same view of point as you do?
I think there's a good story here, and the story that is encouraging for me is what we've seen happen in Germany. So we had, as you well know, at the time of the Syrian crisis, roughly 1 million people arrive in Germany. They weren't all Syrian. Many were from other parts, they were from Africa and many other places. And at first, that was very well received, and Angela Merkel, the chancellor, was lauded as, having been a compassionate person, etc. And then it started to turn, and everyone was starting to say, we don't, the Germans don't want this many people, and Angela Merkel is in trouble, etc., etc. Well, turns out, I think you're right, that the average person is waiting to see how this actually works, and it turns out it's working relatively well in Germany. In fact, only 250,000 people have made refugee claims so far in Germany, not 1 million. Angela Merkel's popularity has gone back. It looks like she's going to win the next election, and even if she doesn't, she's going to lose to a social democratic candidate who's even more favorable towards immigration and refugee claims. So I think it's very easy to give up on politicians and assume that this sort of populist negative sentiment about immigration and refugees will win out. But there are good examples where it doesn't win out. Certainly in Canada, our Prime Minister, I would say one of the greatest sources of his popularity is the positive approach he's taken around refugees. So it is possible for politicians to win and be compassionate. There are other countries where that seems not to be true. I mentioned Hungary. That's a country which is very insular in its culture. And unfortunately, in my view, they've elected a prime minister who is extremely negative to immigration, but he sadly seems to be representing the views of a lot of the people in the country. So it's a very culturally and country-specific set of issues, I think.
Indeed, the volunteer work is a very critical core value for Tzu Chi. But more than that is, I would also like to bring up Taiwan. This country is also a very volunteer-based country. In many ways, we put in volunteer hours, etc., in a very high numbers as compared to other countries, the equal size or the equal GDP. More than that is, our country also encourage us, especially medical university like I'm serving for, to send the medical mission team to many other countries. For example, Swaziland, St. Toope, and many others, Marshall Island, for example. Yeah, so I think these are all about the core value of do the volunteer and be a volunteer. 我的心